Hey, amazing viewers, before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The unexpected arrival. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over Street Helena Community Hospital as the thick summer air clung to the city. Inside, the hum of ceiling fans did little to combat the stifling heat, and the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the corridors. Dr. Neil Carter, a 26-year-old junior physician, barely had time to register the discomfort. His white coat was already damp with sweat, but he moved with purpose, barely looking up from the clipboard in his hand. His shift had started hours ago, yet there was no end in sight. Patients filled every available seat in the waiting room, the low murmur of conversations occasionally interrupted by a child's cry or the desperate pleas of a worried relative. Neil had seen it all: broken bones, fevers, infections, and the occasional emergency that sent the entire ward into a frenzy. But today, an unshakable feeling of dread gnawed at him. It was the kind of unease that settled in his chest without warning. Maybe it was the way the air seemed too still, or how every case felt a little heavier than usual. He had learned to trust his gut. It had never failed him before. Just as he handed a prescription slip to an elderly woman and offered a tired but genuine smile, the moment shattered. "Help! Someone help us!" The cry rang through the hospital doors, slicing through the noise like a blade. Neil's head snapped up as two men rushed in, their shirts stained with sweat and dust, their eyes wide with panic. Between them, a young woman dangled limply, her body barely held up by their grasp, her head lolled to the side, her long, tangled hair matted against her pale, sweat-slicked face. But what caught Neil's attention first wasn't her lifeless expression. It was her swollen belly. She was heavily pregnant, and she was in serious trouble. "Get a gurney, now." Neil barked, already moving toward them. The hospital staff sprang into action, pushing aside chairs and making way as nurses wheeled in a stretcher. The men gently laid the woman down, their hands shaking as they let go. She collapsed, right there on the street, one of them panted, wiping his brow with a trembling hand. She was clutching her stomach, gasping for air. "We didn't know what to do, so we brought her here." Neil barely heard them. His focus was entirely on the woman lying before him. Her skin was ashen, clammy to the touch. Her breathing was erratic, her pulse dangerously weak. Every second counted. "What's her name?" he asked, as he motioned for a nurse to start an IV. I don't know," the man stammered. She was alone. Neil's gaze flickered to her face again, trying to place her, but she was a stranger. He reached for her wrist, pressing his fingers against the fragile beat of her pulse. She barely stirred. Then, all at once, her body jerked. Her eyes snapped open, wild with fear, and when she spoke, her voice was nothing more than a desperate, broken whisper. "My baby, please, save my baby." Her cry was barely audible, but it cut through Neil like a knife. "You're safe," he assured her, his voice steady despite the rapid thud of his heart. "We're going to help you, but I need you to stay calm." A fresh wave of pain ripped through her, and she arched off the gurney, her fingers clawing at the sheets beneath her. "Something's wrong," she gasped. "I can feel it. Something's wrong." Neil pressed his hand gently against her belly, feeling the unnatural rigidity beneath his palm. His throat tightened. She was in active labor, and it wasn't progressing the way it should. He turned to the nurses. "Get her to the maternity ward, now. She's dilated past 8 centimeters," one of them called out, reading the examination results. "But her vitals are dropping fast." Neil cursed under his breath. A natural birth wasn't an option. This was an emergency, and there was only one way to save her and the baby. She needed surgery. But that presented a whole new problem. There was no on-call surgeon. Neil clenched his jaw. He was not a surgeon, but he had assisted in procedures before. He had trained under some of the best, watched their hands move with precision and certainty. He could do this. He had to do this. His gaze flickered back to the woman, whose nails were digging into her palm, drawing tiny crescents of blood. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. Her lips trembled. "Danielle." He nodded. "Danielle, listen to me. We need to do an emergency C-section. It's the only way to keep you and your baby safe." Tears pooled in her eyes. She was terrified, and yet she nodded. "Please, just let my baby live." Neil swallowed hard, gripping her hand for just a moment before pulling away. "I promise you, I'll do everything I can." He didn't know then how much those words would come to mean. What happens next? Danielle is rushed to the operating room. Neil, with no available surgeon, must perform the C-section himself. The moment he delivers the baby, a shocking truth is revealed. It's not one baby. It's two. But when he looks closer, his breath catches in his throat. The entire room falls silent. Something is terribly, terribly wrong. A shocking discovery. The cold glare of the operating room lights reflected off the stainless steel surgical instruments, neatly arranged on a tray beside the table. The room buzzed with a tense energy as Dr. Neil Carter took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. He had scrubbed in, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils, but nothing could prepare him for what lay ahead. He was about to perform a C-section on his own. The monitors beeped urgently in the background, tracking Danielle's racing heart rate and the faint, irregular heartbeat of the baby inside her. Every second that passed was a second closer to disaster. A nurse adjusted the overhead light, while another handed Neil a scalpel, her eyes filled with unspoken concern. Everyone in that room knew. This was uncharted territory. Neil looked down at Danielle, who lay still and pale, her lips trembling as she whispered a single plea. "Save my baby." He met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I will." But in truth, he didn't know if that was a promise he could keep. A risk unlike any other. Neil had performed countless emergency procedures in his short career, but never alone. He had always been the assistant, the one handing over instruments, watching the experienced hands of his mentors move with practiced precision. Now, there was no one to take over if he faltered. He exhaled sharply. Failure was not an option. With a precise incision, he cut through the layers of skin and muscle, revealing the fragile life within. Blood seeped onto the gauze as he worked quickly but carefully, his hands guided more by instinct than experience. Minutes stretched into eternity. And then, a tiny body emerged. For the briefest moment, the entire room held its breath. Neil gently lifted the infant, his fingers careful as he turned the small, wriggling body over. And then his own breath hitched. Something was wrong. It wasn't one baby. It was two. The weight in his hands doubled as he pulled the second baby from the incision, but as he turned them over, his stomach dropped. The twins were conjoined. Their fragile, impossibly small bodies were joined at the skull. For a heartbeat, Neil couldn't move. A hush fell over the operating room. The nurses exchanged glances of disbelief. One of them even took a step back, her face going pale. The reality settled in like a crushing weight. This was a case no one in this hospital had ever dealt with before. Neil's mind raced, but before he could process his next move, a weak, broken voice shattered the silence. "My baby, Danielle." Though she was weak, her eyes searched his face, desperate for answers. Neil swallowed hard. "Danielle, you had twins." Her lips parted in shock, her breath coming in short gasps. "Twins?" Neil hesitated, gripping the tiny bodies tighter in his hands. How could he say it? How could he break her heart in the worst possible way? Finally, he whispered, "Danielle, they're conjoined." For a moment, she didn't react. Then her breathing turned erratic. Her hands clawed at the bedsheets, her entire body shaking with panic. No, 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 no. Her voice cracked, the devastation unmistakable. That's not possible. I can't. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. Neil quickly turned to the nurse. Get her oxygen. The nurse rushed forward, adjusting the mask over Danielle's face, but she fought it, shaking her head violently. No, tell me this isn't real. Tell me my babies are okay. But Neil couldn't lie. Instead, he placed the fragile twins into an incubator, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison. They were alive, but their future was uncertain. Danielle let out a heart-wrenching sob, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the incubator. What do I do? She whispered. Her question hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. Neil's throat tightened. He had no answer. But he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her alone in this. A mother's heartbreak. The hours blurred together. The surgery had been successful, but the emotional wreckage was just beginning. Danielle lay in a hospital bed, her body weaker than ever, but her eyes locked onto the incubator. She hadn't spoken much since the birth. Only one question left her lips over and over. What will happen to them? Neil had spent hours researching, making frantic calls to specialists. The truth was, the chances of survival for conjoined twins were low, and separating them, it would require one of the most complex surgeries in medical history, a surgery this hospital couldn't afford. Neil sat beside Danielle, his exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes. We'll find a way, he said, though he didn't know how. Danielle turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this alone. Neil's chest tightened. She wasn't wrong. She had no family, no home, and now, 2 babies who would need more medical care than anyone could ever prepare for. He could see the weight of it crushing her, breaking her before she even had a chance to fight. And then, without thinking, Neil made a decision that would change all their lives forever. You won't have to. Danielle blinked. What? Neil took a breath. You and the twins can stay with me. The words felt surreal, even to him. A nurse nearby gasped, but Neil didn't care. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't even a senior doctor. But he couldn't let them suffer alone. Danielle's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of something different, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A home, a hope, and a storm brewing. The rain pelted the windshield as Dr. Neil Carter steered his battered sedan through the dark streets of the city. The headlights barely cut through the heavy downpour, each wiper swiped, struggling to clear the blur of water streaming down the glass. In the passenger seat, Danielle sat silently, her fingers gripping the hospital-issued blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, never left the small bundle cradled in her lap. 2 tiny infants lay nestled together, their delicate heads bound in soft gauze, their breathing shallow but steady. Gus and Jacob, her sons. Even now, Danielle could barely process what had happened in the last 24 hours. Twins. Conjoined. Fragile beyond words. The hospital bills were piling up. The doctors were skeptical about survival. And yet, here she was, in the car of a man who had no reason to help her, yet had offered her everything. Danielle's throat tightened as she whispered, Are you sure about this? Neil didn't take his eyes off the road. I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't. She bit her lip, looking down at her sons. I don't know how to thank you. Neil exhaled through his nose. You don't need to. Just focus on them. That's all that matters right now. Danielle stared out the rain-streaked window. It had been years since she had a place to call home. And now she was being taken in by a man she had known for barely a day. A man who had risked everything to bring her babies into the world. Why? She was afraid to ask. A new beginning. Neil's apartment was small but warm, tucked inside an aging brick complex in the quieter side of the city. The faint scent of coffee and old books filled the air as he unlocked the door, pushing it open for Danielle to step inside. It wasn't much. A tiny living room crammed with second-hand furniture, an outdated kitchen with flickering fluorescent lights, and a single bedroom. But there was a couch and a heater, and more importantly, it was safe. Danielle hesitated in the doorway, her arms tightening around the twins. "This is where you live." Neil scratched the back of his head, suddenly self-conscious. "Yeah, well, I wasn't exactly expecting guests." Danielle turned to him, her expression unreadable. "This is the nicest place I've been in years." Neil didn't know what to say to that. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured to the living room. "You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep on the couch." Danielle's eyes widened. "Neil, I can't." "Yes, you can." He met her gaze, his voice firm. "You just gave birth. You need the bed." No arguing. Her lips pressed together, but tears shone in her eyes. She nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. A fragile peace. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, late-night cries, and endless hospital visits. Neil was back at the hospital during the day, juggling shifts while calling every specialist he could find about the possibility of separation surgery. At night, he returned home to Danielle sitting on the couch, feeding the twins by the dim glow of a bedside lamp. It was hard. Gus and Jacob were so fragile, their tiny bodies dependent on oxygen tubes and specialized feeding schedules. Every time one of them stirred, Danielle's entire body tensed, as if expecting the worst. Neil saw it. The fear, the desperation, the quiet heartbreak of a mother who had no idea how to save her children. One night, as he leaned against the doorway, watching her rock Gus and Jacob to sleep, he finally asked, "How did you end up alone?" Danielle flinched, but she didn't look up. For a long time, she was silent. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear, she said, "Because I had no choice." Neil waited. Finally, she spoke. A past she tried to escape. Danielle had been just 19 when she met the man who would ruin her life. Liam Becker. He had been charming, older, and dangerously persuasive. He had promised her the world, and she, a girl who had never known love, had believed him. But soon, the promises turned to threats. The kind words became shouted insults. And one night, when she was barely pregnant, he hit her for the first time. Danielle's voice cracked as she whispered, "I should have left then. I should have run. But I was stupid. I told myself it wouldn't happen again." Neil clenched his jaw. He had seen this story before. A girl, too scared to leave. A man, too cruel to let her go. It always ended in pain. Always. Tears dripped down Danielle's cheeks as she stared at Gus and Jacob. "The day I finally ran, I had nothing. No money. No family to go to. I slept in shelters, did whatever I had to do just to make it to the next day." Her hands trembled. "But I was so stupid. I thought, if I could just survive until the baby came, everything would be okay." Her voice broke. "I didn't know it was going to be like this." Neil swallowed the lump in his throat. He had seen people in pain before. But this was different. This was a mother drowning, desperately reaching for a lifeline. So he did the only thing he could. He reached across the couch and gently placed his hand over hers. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Danielle turned to him, her eyes shining with something fragile and raw. For the first time, in a long time, she believed him. A shadow in the dark. The night was quiet when Neil's phone buzzed. He groggily reached for it, barely registering the number. Then, as he read the message, his stomach turned to ice. "I know where she is." Neil bolted upright, his heart hammering. Liam Becker, Danielle's abusive ex. He had found them. Neil's hands shook as he dialed a number, his voice sharp with urgency. "This is Dr. Carter at Street Helena. I need security detail at my residence. Now." As he hung up, he looked toward the bedroom, where Danielle and the twins slept soundly, unaware of the storm about to hit. Neil clenched his fists. No one was taking them away. Not now. Not ever. A battle for survival. A heavy silence hung in the air as Dr. Neil Carter sat alone in the dim glow of his apartment. The weight of exhaustion pressed against his chest, but sleep was a distant luxury. His phone sat on the table in front of him, the screen still glowing with the last message. I know where she is. Liam Becker had found them. Neil's jaw tightened. He had dealt with life and death situations before, had fought against time, disease, and fate. But this was different. This was a fight against something human, something cruel, and it terrified him. A mother's nightmare. In the next room, Danielle slept restlessly, curled protectively around the twins. She had no idea what was coming. For the past few days, she had been living in a fragile state of hope. She had allowed herself to believe, for the first time in years, that she was safe. Neil wasn't ready to shatter that yet. But as he stared at his phone, his mind raced. What could he do? Call the police. Liam had never been charged. The system wouldn't protect her. Run. Where? With what money? Neil clenched his fists. No, they weren't running. The knock at the door. The knock came at exactly 2:13 a.m. A sharp, deliberate sound. Not frantic, not polite. Neil's stomach turned to ice. He rose to his feet, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The apartment was too quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic breathing from the next room. Another knock, harder this time. Neil forced himself to move. He stepped toward the door, his fingers flexing at his sides. He wasn't a fighter. He was a doctor. He didn't know how to take down a man like Liam Becker. But if Liam thought for 1 second that he could take Danielle or those babies away, he was dead wrong. Neil pulled the door open. And there he was. Liam. A towering figure in a worn leather jacket, his dark eyes scanning the apartment in a slow, predatory way. You must be the doctor. His voice was smooth, mocking. Nice place. A little small for a family, though. Neil's body tensed. He knows about the twins. A dangerous game. Neil stepped forward, blocking the doorway. You shouldn't be here. Liam smirked. And yet, here I am. His gaze flickered past Neil, toward the bedroom door. Neil shifted, blocking his view. Whatever you think you're entitled to, forget it. You lost that right when you hurt her. Liam's smile didn't falter. You don't get to decide that. Neil's fingers curled into fists. Legally, she has full custody. Liam laughed softly, shaking his head. You really think that matters? A woman like Danielle, broke, homeless, living off the pity of some doctor. You think a judge won't see that? Neil's heart pounded. He knew the system failed people like Danielle all the time. Liam leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I'll make this simple, Doc. You let me see my kids, or I make things real difficult for you. Neil didn't flinch. You come near them, and I'll make sure you never see the outside of a prison cell again. For the first time, Liam's smirk faded, his jaw clenched. And then, he stepped back. His voice turned cold. We'll see about that. Then, he walked away. Neil stood frozen, watching until Liam disappeared down the hallway. His fists shook at his sides. This wasn't over. Not even close. The breaking point. When Neil closed the door and turned around, Danielle was standing in the hallway, her face pale. She had heard everything. Her arms tightened around her chest, her breathing uneven. He's not going to stop, is he? Neil's stomach nodded. No. Danielle sank onto the couch, her hands gripping her hair. I can't do this again, Neil. I can't live like this. Always running, always scared. Neil sat beside her, his voice calm but firm. You don't have to. She looked at him, eyes wide and desperate. What do you mean? He took a breath. We fight back. A desperate gamble. The next day, Neil made a decision that risked everything. He went to the hospital administration office and filed an official request for financial assistance for the twins' surgery. If it was approved, Gus and Jacob would have a future. But there was a catch. It would make their case public. It would draw attention, media, hospitals, and Liam. Neil knew it was risky, but he had no other choice. And just as he feared, the hospital fought back. "You crossed a line," Carter, his supervisor, Dr. Caldwell, said as she tossed the request onto her desk. "You brought a patient into your personal life. That is not how we do things." Neil's jaw tightened. They had nowhere else to go. Caldwell's expression hardened. "And now, the hospital is being dragged into your little charity case. I have donors calling, asking why we're funding the surgery of 2 infants that might not even survive." Neil's chest burned. "Because they deserve a chance." Caldwell sighed. "And what about the ethical breach? You took a patient home. That alone could get you suspended." Neil's heart pounded. He knew this would happen. He had risked his career, his reputation, everything. But then, Caldwell's voice softened. "You really care about them, don't you?" Neil didn't even hesitate. Yes. A long silence stretched between them. And then, Caldwell reached for the file. "I'll approve it." Neil's eyes widened. "You will." She sighed. "But if anyone finds out about this, you're on your own." "Understood." Neil nodded. "Understood." He walked out of that office, his heart pounding. The twins were one step closer to a future. But Liam was still out there. And the real battle was just beginning. A fight worth everything. The tension in Street Helena Community Hospital was palpable. Nurses moved with quiet urgency, doctors exchanged hushed conversations, and in the middle of it all, Dr. Neil Carter stood frozen, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The email on his phone glowed like a death sentence. "Legal proceedings have been initiated by Mr. Liam Becker for custody of Gus and Jacob Carter." Neil's pulse thundered in his ears. He's trying to take them. His mind raced. Liam had no right. He had abandoned Danielle, left her with nothing. But now that she had help, now that the twins had a chance, he wanted back in. No, absolutely not. Neil turned on his heel and marched down the hallway. He didn't care that his shift wasn't over, that he had left a patient mid-charting. None of it mattered. He had to find Danielle. The devastating news. When Neil reached the hospital's small waiting lounge, he found her exactly where he knew she'd be, beside the incubator. Her fingers traced gentle circles on the glass, her face weary, her dark eyes heavy with exhaustion. The twins lay inside, connected yet separate, tiny yet full of life. Neil's chest tightened. She had no idea what was coming. He cleared his throat. "Danielle." She turned to him, immediately sensing something was wrong. "What happened?" Neil swallowed hard. "Liam is filing for custody." The words landed like a bomb. Danielle's face drained of color. Her breathing turned uneven. No, he can't. He doesn't care about them. She gripped the sides of the incubator. "He'll take them from me." Neil stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. "Not if I have anything to say about it." But even as he said it, the fear gnawed at him. Liam had money, lawyers, power. And all Danielle had was him. The courtroom battle. 2 weeks later, Neil sat beside Danielle in a cold, sterile courtroom. Across from them sat Liam. He looked unbothered, smug even, dressed in a crisp suit that didn't belong to the man Danielle had once feared. He smirked at her, as if they were simply playing a game. Neil's blood boiled. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Becker, you're claiming paternity rights. Why now?" Liam sat back in his chair. "I was unaware of the twins' medical condition. As a father, I have a right to be involved in their care." Danielle gripped Neil's hand under the table. "He's lying." Neil spoke up before she could. Your Honor, Liam Becker was never involved. He abandoned Danielle while she was pregnant. He has no financial contributions, no history of support. Liam cut in smoothly. Because she disappeared. I couldn't find her. Danielle snapped. Because you were hurting me. The courtroom fell silent. The judge exhaled slowly. Ms. Daniels, do you have any proof of past abuse? Danielle's hands trembled. No. And just like that, Liam smiled. Neil's stomach twisted. This wasn't going to be as easy as proving he was a bad person. The system didn't work that way. A desperate move. After the hearing, Neil paced outside the courthouse, his hands tugging at his hair. Danielle sat on the bench, holding back tears. We're going to lose them, aren't we? Neil turned to her. Not if I can help it. She blinked. What do you mean? Neil hesitated. He had been thinking about this since the moment he saw the email. He knew how the system worked. Liam was stable, employed, and could argue that Danielle was unfit. But if Neil got involved, if he gave the court another option, everything could change. Danielle, let me adopt them. Her breath hitched. What? Neil took her hands in his. If I'm their legal guardian, Liam has no case. He's only coming after them because he thinks you're vulnerable. But I can fight him in ways you can't. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Neil, you don't have to do this. He held her gaze. I want to. I already love them like they're mine. Danielle let out a broken sob. You'd do that for us. Neil nodded. In a heartbeat. A new family. A week later, the court ruled in their favor. The adoption papers were signed. Liam was denied custody. And just like that, Gus and Jacob Carter had a father. Danielle stood beside Neil outside the courthouse, her hands trembling as she held the final paperwork. The storm had passed, but her heart still pounded. She turned to him, tears slipping down her face. I don't know how to thank you. Neil smiled, looking down at the tiny boys in their car seats. You already have. Danielle let out a shaky laugh. How? Neil looked at her. By trusting me. And for the first time, Danielle truly felt like they were safe. Not just safe. Home. Epilogue. A miracle worth fighting for. The day of the twins' surgery arrived. It was the hardest day of their lives. Neil and Danielle sat in the hospital waiting room, hands tightly clasped as the surgeons worked. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, after 12 agonizing hours, the doors swung open. Dr. Caldwell stepped out, removing her mask. Her voice was thick with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with something else. The surgery was a success. Danielle let out a strangled sob, collapsing against Neil. Neil exhaled, his body finally releasing the fear he had been holding in. They had done it. The twins were free. 6 months later. Laughter filled Neil's apartment. Danielle sat on the floor, watching as Gus and Jacob, finally separate but still inseparable, crawled toward her. Neil stood behind her, arms crossed, smiling. They had made it. And against all odds, they were a family. The love that built a family. It had been 1 year since the storm. 1 year since Gus and Jacob were separated. Since Liam disappeared from their lives. Since Neil took a leap of faith and turned a desperate mother and her fragile sons into his own family. And yet, as Neil stood in the warm glow of the sunrise, watching 2 tiny figures wobble toward him on unsteady legs, he realized something profound. It hadn't been his act of kindness that saved them. It had been them who saved him. The first steps. Danielle sat on the soft patch of grass in the park, her eyes wide with excitement as Gus took another shaky step forward, his little arms outstretched toward Neil. Jacob, not to be outdone by his brother, wobbled forward next, giggling as he stumbled and landed right into Neil's waiting arms. Neil laughed, scooping them both up. Look at you two. Walking already? You're gonna make me miss the days when you couldn't escape diaper changes." Danielle shook her head, smiling. "You're the only dad who complains about progress." Neil's chest tightened at the word. Dad. He hadn't expected to love that title so much, but he did. More than he ever thought possible. A different kind of love. As they sat under the shade of an old oak tree, watching the twins chase after a butterfly, Neil turned to Danielle. She was watching them too, her face soft with a kind of peace he had never seen before. A peace she had fought for. A peace she deserved. Neil swallowed, his voice quieter than usual. "Danielle, are you happy?" She turned to him, startled by the question. Then, after a moment, she smiled. Not the shy, uncertain smile she once had, but a real one. A smile of contentment, of gratitude, of something deeper. "For the first time in my life, yes." Neil felt something inside him shift. Something unspoken. Something neither of them needed to say aloud. Because love wasn't just romance. It was what they had built. The truth of family. Gus and Jacob tumbled into their laps, both giggling uncontrollably. Danielle kissed each of their foreheads. Neil ruffled their hair. And in that moment, he knew something for certain. Family wasn't about blood. It wasn't about what was planned. It was about who showed up, who fought for you, who chose you again and again when the world didn't. And as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in gold and pink, Neil finally understood. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. It was better. Because love wasn't about how you got there. It was about never leaving. And that was the only thing that mattered. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.